We're going. All right. This is the last lecture series, Metaphysics of God, and this is going to be asking why believe in God. So we're going to look at all the arguments for God and the issues around those arguments. There are three types of arguments for God. So it's going to be ontological, cosmological, and teleological. Ontological arguments for God, they hinge on the concept of God to prove God's existence. So we're going to look at all kinds of issues there. Cosmological arguments, they look at this the necessity for there to be a first cause. So a cosmological argument is looking at the universe on the whole and asking, well, what brought the universe into existence? What was the creator? What was the first cause? And that's the argument there, is that it's going to be God. Teleological arguments are known as design arguments. Telos being the purpose of a thing, or its aim, its end. So what was the purpose? What's the purpose of the universe? How is it being given its aims? And that will be, again, God. That the universe seems like some kind of design. So we've got a priori, a posteriori, and then we've got arguments from analogy. So the design arguments are arguments from analogy. It looks at the world, says it seems like it's been designed because of the things that we know have been designed, and therefore there must be an intelligent being that was the designer. Starting with ontological arguments for God. Some of these are perhaps the easiest ones. So first of all, St. Anselm's ontological argument for God. So St. Anselm said, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. The greatest possible being you can imagine. So God is this greatest, most perfect thing. Things can exist either in the mind or in reality. It's just a statement, a petty statement about the way things are. Premise 3, it is greater to exist in both the mind and reality than in the mind alone. It's better for Harry Potter to be real than just an imaginary thing. If God is the greatest being, God must exist in both the mind and reality. Therefore, God must exist in reality. So what Anselm's doing here is he's starting with the concept of God being this most perfect, most greatest being there is. Now, if God is this most perfect, greatest being that you can imagine, it's no good for that just to be something in the imagination, because then it wouldn't be the greatest being that exists. What is more perfect? Just God in the mind, or God in the mind and in reality? For Anselm, the greatest must be obviously God as we imagine it and God actually being real. And by that a priori argument, he comes to the conclusion that God must exist because God is this greatest thing. So there is an argument against this, and it's called Gounod's perfect island, or Gounod, or however else you want to say it. And the argument is basically to take Anselm's argument about this greatest being, right, and showing that if it was this greatest being, then it must exist in reality, or it wouldn't be the greatest being, therefore God exists, and showing that the argument is absurd. So this is a sort of reductio ad absurdum argument. And it's to say the same thing. Imagine the most perfect island that you could ever imagine. It's the greatest possible island ever. The greatest possible island ever, if it's the greatest possible island, has to also exist in reality. Therefore, this island that you imagine, this greatest possible island, exists. So it's taking the same form of the argument that Anselm used for God and using it to show that thinking it in a different way, a perfect island, shows the conclusion is just absurd. Of course, this perfect island in your head does not exist. You could argue that maybe it does exist in some other possible world. So if you want to look at the differences with all possible worlds, you might argue that in some possible world, this contingent island will exist. That's perhaps an argument against this. But it does at least show there is some absurdity to Anselm's argument. Just defining the perfect island means it ought to exist, according to Anselm. So we're going to look at Malcolm's reply, but Malcolm essentially is saying that God is not the same thing as an island. God is this necessary being. Islands are these worldly things. God is this otherworldly thing. So it's not the right comparison to make between God and an island. That's why he would say Gonillo's argument doesn't actually hold, because it's not comparing apples with apples. So let's have a look at Descartes' ontological argument. We've kind of already looked at this a little bit. Descartes' ontological argument, we saw a little bit of that in the intuition-deduction thesis. Same kind of a priori argument. God is a supremely perfect being, possessing all perfections that you could imagine. Existence itself is a perfection, according to Descartes. And a being that lacks existence would be less perfect than one that exists. So we can see how it's quite similar to Anselm's argument. Premise 3, since God is defined as a supremely perfect being, he must have all perfections, including existence. Therefore, God must exist, as existence is part of his essential nature, being the most supremely perfect being. Just as a triangle's nature entails that it has 3 sides. Okay? So, let's consider Hume's objection here. Hume, they reject a priori arguments to prove matters of fact, remembering that an a priori argument is an argument that is just done by a process of reason. It doesn't have to look out into the world. Okay? It's not a posteriori, right? It's not looking out there for empirical facts. It's just proved by pure reason. So Hume would say that a priori arguments don't prove matters of fact. Remember in Hume's fork here, relations of ideas, matters of fact. Matters of fact are those empirical truths. They're truths about things that exist in the world, rather than just being about relations of ideas, i.e. truths about thoughts, like 2 + 2 = 4. And the argument here is that there's no rational process that you can go through without actually looking into the world that would prove that anything in the world actually exists, without actually verifying it by seeing it in the world. So you have to see it to believe it, in essence, is what Hume's saying here. Another problem is what we call existence is not a predicate. So this is Kant's and Russell's argument. Recalling back to Descartes' ontological argument for God, he said, God has all perfections. He's describing God. A predicate is a way of describing a thing. Okay, it's the description of a thing. And he says one of God's perfections must be existence. So the ontological arguments seem to be using existence as a describing word of something, i.e. that it exists. But existence isn't actually a description of a thing. Of course, the thing may exist or may not exist, but existence itself isn't a description. And you can't prove that something exists just by describing it as existent. You have to actually see that it exists. So for Russell, he says that you have sets of things, say cows or unicorns. That is a set of things, and you can describe cows and unicorns in a variety of ways. Whether it exists just means that there is at least one of those set of things in the world. If there isn't, it doesn't exist. But it doesn't. But just saying existence of a thing, a set of things, doesn't describe it in any way. It just either entails that there is one of it or there isn't. And the only way we can know that, according to the empiricists, is by it being proven as being there in the world. So that's the key problem with ontological arguments. They're trying to prove the existence of God by a description rather than by some sort of verification. Right, this is the last of the ontological arguments. Then we're going to move on to cosmological. And this is Malcolm's. So this is the more tricky one. So I'll just brief through it and I'll explain what's going on. So he says, premise 1, God cannot come into existence or out of existence. So God is not contingent. He's either there or is not, eternally or everlasting or whatever. He starts with existence and ends. Doesn't actually come into existence or out of existence. He's either there or he's not. So if God does not exist, then his existence is logically impossible. Premise 3, if God does exist, then his existence isn't logically necessary. Either God's existence is logically impossible or logically necessary. God's existence is not logically impossible. There's no logical contradiction in God existing. Therefore, God's existence is logically necessary. Therefore, God exists. So, to explain what's going on here, God is described as this necessary being. It's not a contingent being. Remembering the difference between a contingent and necessary fact. Okay, contingent facts, it doesn't have to be the case. Okay, the fact that Ben's here, eating chocolate, is contingent on some other facts that made it so that Ben was here today. It didn't have to be that way. To say that something is necessary is to say that it is always that way. It doesn't matter what happens in the world. It's true in all possible worlds, not just in this possible world. A contingent fact is true in this possible world. Necessary facts are true in all possible worlds. It's never going to be false if it is to be true. The only way a necessary proposition would be false if it is logically impossible, if it's illogical. That's where it's true in no possible worlds. It's impossible. So the idea is that we're describing God as this necessary being. It's not contingent on anything. So if God is this necessary being by the very concept of God, then either it's true or false. If God is false, there isn't such a necessary being, that must entail, according to Malcolm, that God is logically impossible. God is impossible. Couldn't be possible in any possible world. But Malcolm thinks that God is possible. There's nothing to say that God is impossible, logical contradiction. Therefore, given that God is a necessary being, it must be true in all possible worlds. Therefore, it must be logically necessary. So if this seems odd to you, it's because it is an odd argument. Although the intricacies of the argument might be quite difficult to understand. So to look at the criticism might help to understand a bit more. Hicks' criticism is to say, looking at something as a logical necessity is different from a factual necessity. So a logical necessity is a necessity in thought. 2 + 2 = 4 is a logical necessity. It can't be false. But to say something factual about the world, a factual necessity about a thing, is not the same, cannot be proven by logical necessity. And God isn't a logical necessity, according to Malcolm. The logical necessity of God doesn't make it true that he is factually necessary. He's actually here in the world, an actual existing thing. So, again, even this criticism is a little bit difficult to hinge on the difference between a logical necessity and a factual necessity. Some people might argue that there is no such thing as a factual necessity. Something's either contingently true in the world, just as a matter of what's actually there, or something is a matter of thought, i.e. logically true. It's just true in the nature of the thought. It's logically necessary because of the thought itself. Whether there is such a thing as factual necessity, that is what's open to debate. So you might argue that, of course, seeing God in such a way as a particular concept makes it logically necessary that God is this thing that we're thinking of as a concept, but doesn't make it actually true of the world, because what's true of the world is only as a matter of contingent fact, i.e. the ways that we actually can see that things are true as they are in the moment that we see them. So that is just something to have a think about, have a read into in a bit more detail. Of course, some people think there is this difference between metaphysical necessity or factual necessity and logical necessity, but there is a debate around that, whether that there is a difference between those. But at least the criticism would be that seeing something as logically necessary doesn't actually make it true of the world as a matter of fact. Okay, that's ontological arguments done. Cosmological arguments now. So cosmological arguments are looking at the universe on the whole and seeing how God must be the cause of the universe coming into being. So we see in ancient Greek times, ancient Greek philosophy, that there was a discussion around this idea of the unmoved mover. The Aristotelian and Plato's days, this was something that was discussed. So the idea is this: suppose there is no ultimate mover, no particular beginning of all things, in which case nothing is causing the first thing to move, because there would just be this infinite chain. But if nothing caused the chain, there would be no chain at all, because nothing can come from nothing. There is clearly a chain of moving things, i.e. all the things that's happening now, in motion. Therefore, there must be an ultimate mover, an unmoved mover. So that is the basis of cosmological arguments right there. That's what's going on here. So cosmological arguments are going to hinge on this idea that in this, what we can see as a finite series of causal events in our experience of the world, there always seems to be a beginning and an end. We don't really see this infinite series. That's what a lot of people think is a logical contradiction of this infinite series of causation. There must be a start to it all. There must be the thing that caused the motion in the first place. And that thing is what they're going to say is God. So there are a few different types of this argument. The Kalam argument comes from the Middle Ages. Kalam arguments was from some Islamic thinkers, Islamic scholars and philosophers who went out there to seek the truth about the world and the truth about God. Now, out of this, one of the arguments is that every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. That's just a matter of fact. It's empirical fact, a posteriori fact. And then premise 2 is going to say that the world is this being which begins as well. It seems like the world itself has begun as a being. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning. So again, this argument hinges on this idea that there couldn't be this infinite series of time. Just as everything we know that comes into existence and out of existence must have been the world itself as well, as a being like we are, just at a greater cosmological level. Therefore, it must have had a beginning. Because let's say there was an infinite series, the idea that 12 years Jupiter orbits the Sun, 30 years Saturn, all right? Which means that Jupiter orbits the Sun 2 times more than Saturn at least. In an infinite series, that wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense to say that Jupiter orbits the Earth 2 times more than Saturn, because it's an infinite series. So there doesn't become this sort of finite conclusion of things in an infinite series. That's as far as the argument goes. Therefore, the argument is that an infinite series doesn't make sense, because we know that it's true that there is a finite series of things in the world. So how can we then, on that basis, see that there is an infinite series of things? But we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So the next argument, it comes from Aquinas. Now Aquinas he sort of went to town with this, 5 different arguments, called them the 5 ways, all right? We only need to know these first 3 waves, okay, or 3 ways, sorry. We don't look at the 4th way in philosophy, and then the 5th way we look at in teleological arguments. So argument from motion, the first way. Second way is the argument from causation, and the 3rd way is argument from contingency. These are all cosmological arguments. Okay, so we're going to look at these in cosmological arguments. The first way is just basically the same as the ancient Greek said, pretty much. Things are in a state of motion or change. You know, something that's cold becomes hot because of some state of motion, some state of change that makes it hot. Nothing can move or change itself. A cold thing can't just become hot. It has to have some sort of cause, this chain of events that leads to it becoming hot. Premise 3, imagine everything was a second mover. So everything was just a mover of something else. All right, there was nothing that was the beginning. It was just an infinite regress of things moving things, but nothing being the start of that. Aquinas says, by reductio ad absurdum, if it were true that everything was a second mover, there was an infinite regress, then there would be no prime mover, there would be no first mover. But this must be false according to premise 3, because if there was no prime mover, then the motion of the universe must have moved itself. So that doesn't make sense according to Aquinas. Conclusion, therefore there must be an unmoved mover. There must have been a first mover that was not moved by itself. Or was not moved by something else, sorry. But then you've got this argument, this sort of prime mover, the unmoved mover. I suppose you could argue it goes against premise 2, that nothing can move itself. But you would argue that the unmoved mover, God, has moved itself as the beginning. Maybe some would say. Another argument from Rowe is that Aquinas doesn't actually demonstrate why an infinite series of causes couldn't actually exist. There's no real reason, according to Aquinas, as to why there couldn't be this infinite series of second movers. Okay? Things moving things and there being no start to it. Nor why it has to be this unmoved mover God as the single prime mover. So Rowe thinks that there isn't really good enough reason there. As far as we know, why does it have to be that way? Why do we have to accept it? But again, we're going to look more about this possibility of the infinite series in a little while. So the second way from causation, everything that exists is caused by something else. It's a similar kind of argument. Nothing can cause itself as it would need to exist before itself, which is impossible. An infinite regress of causes is not possible. So there must be a first uncaused cause. And this first cause is God, who initiates the chain of causes. Similar kind of argument to the unmoved mover, but this is more to do with causing itself to cause more things. But again, a criticism is, why does God, it's called special pleading, this is the idea of special pleading, why is it that God is so different to everything else? We all need causes, right? There has to be a cause for us to be here, okay, or to do anything that we do. But why does God, why is God this thing that doesn't have to have a cause? Call that special pleading. What's so different? And what can you prove about God being so different that God doesn't require an explanation as being an uncaused causer? So, argument from third way, so contingency. Everything in the universe is contingent. It means it's contingent on something else that's happened. We're contingent on our parents are contingent on X, Y, and Z, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're all contingent on other things. If everything were contingent, there would have been a time when nothing existed. If nothing existed, something could not begin to exist. Okay, so if there was nothing there, how can something come from nothing, is asking the question. Because contingent beings require something there to bring them into existence. Therefore, there must be a necessary being that exists by its own nature and causes the existence of everything else, a being that is not contingent on anything else, as we saw from Malcolm's argument. Therefore, this necessary being is God. So some slightly different, the same kind of argument, just put in a slightly different way, hinging on slightly different concepts there. So the criticism from Mackey is, why does the chain of contingent beings, why could it not exist? Why could it not simply exist infinitely without requiring a necessary being? again, it's just looking at why do we have to accept that has to be this necessary being that makes everything contingently possible? Why could it not just be a chain of contingent things in this infinite series? Very similar kinds of criticisms here. The last argument we're going to look at in cosmological arguments is Leibniz argument for principle of sufficient reason. Okay, so this is Leibniz here. No fact can ever be true or existent, no statement correct unless there is a sufficient reason why things are as they are and not otherwise, even if in most cases we can't know what the reason is. So that's the starting kind of idea from Leibniz. The argument goes as follows. Premise 1. Everything that exists must have a sufficient reason or explanation for why it exists and why it is the way it is. Premise 2. The universe exists, so it must have a sufficient reason for its existence. Premise 3. This sufficient reason cannot lie within the contingent universe itself, because that would be absurd. Conclusion, therefore, the sufficient reason must be found in a necessary being, which is God. So there must be this transcendent thing that transcends the universe, okay, which makes it so that the contingent universe exists. So it's basically hinging on like facts that are contingent require other things to explain them, why they are the way they are. Whereas necessary facts are self-evident. They don't require something to explain why they're true, we would like to say. So a necessary fact, just by seeing that fact is necessarily true, it's self-evidently true, we don't need another explanation. This is sort of like the foundations of knowledge, at least according to Descartes. So it's the same thing. How can we explain why the universe is the way it is? Requires sufficient reason because it's contingent. You know, it's like I require sufficient reason for why Ethan came in late. That's a contingent fact that just happened. I will get that sufficient reason. And that's sort of the problem with the contingent facts of the world. Everything that is, there's always a reason for it. But these necessary facts, we'd like just to say, well, it just is true. You can see it clearly that it's true, self-evidently true. So that's the same with the universe. Must have had that necessary self-evident beginning or reason, and that has to be God as a necessary being. Right, so we're going to go on to issues now of the cosmological arguments for God before moving on to teleological arguments. Before we move on to issues, what I will say is, if you think about what it means for causation to happen within yourself, this could be a good one looking back at metaphysics of mind. We like to think that there is causes for the things that we do. And perhaps there is some realm of causation happening out there. But in terms of like free will and those kinds of things and your own intentions and free association, maybe that doesn't have the kind of cause that mechanical deterministic things do. So have a think about that in terms of, that doesn't seem to have this sufficient reason, this sufficient causation. Maybe that's not a second mover, maybe that's moved within itself, the unmoved mover that starts something as part of your free will. Something to consider. Anyway, issues with cosmological arguments. First one, the possibility of an infinite series. In mathematics, set theory, we seem to have proved that there's no problem looking at infinite series of sets of things. So why, if there's no problem now in mathematics and physics of this idea of infinity, why do we now have to accept that an infinite series of causal events couldn't be also true? On the other hand, some people think that infinite series, infinite set isn't really something that we can actually conceive of. There isn't really, in our concept of things, anything infinite there. We can call something infinite as a placeholder, but can we really conceive of something infinite? Does it really make sense? Because if it does make sense, surely can we conceive of it? But any concept that we have of something infinite seems to be finite. It seems to end somewhere. You could say a series of numbers that just goes on forever and ever and ever and ever, right? But the concept in itself will end somewhere. So quite possibly we don't actually have the ability to conceive of or make sense of what it means for something to be infinite in our world of finite things and finite thoughts. Hume's objection of the causal principle. So Hume asks, what is causation? Do we really, is an empiricist, all right? Is causation a relation of ideas or a matters of fact? Well, causation doesn't seem like necessarily relations of ideas, nor does it seem like a matter of fact. Do we observe causation? Hume thinks no. We just experience one event following from another, and another event following from that. We never really see the cause. We only see a series of events. And just by the habit of experience, we call it causation. But in actual fact, we never really see that thing that we want to call a causation. We only really see a pattern, a series of events. And that's all there is. So in that vein, Hume would reject this idea that there must be a cause, because for Hume, we don't even know really what a cause is. It's not relations of ideas. It's not necessarily true. Whatever cause we want to say is the cause isn't necessarily true. Nor does he think we actually see it. We only see that series of events. Although you could argue that that is what causation is. It's a series of events. It's a series of events that follows logically. That it couldn't really be any other way. That's what causation seems to be. That how could, think about a dream, right? Dreams don't seem to follow the same causation as the world that we have here in reality, do they? There's no logical series of events there. So perhaps causation is seeing a logical series of events, which we don't see in dream worlds, imaginary worlds. Perhaps. The fallacy of composition, another one. We've touched on this idea quite a lot, but it's to say just because that something is true of each individual of the set of things doesn't make the whole that same truth true of the whole set. So here's one example. We all have mothers. Humans all have mothers. Okay? Does that make it true then that the whole set of humans has a mother? That is the fallacy of composition. Just because something is true of each individual part of the whole doesn't make it also true of the whole. So to take that onto the universe, cosmological arguments, just because it's true that everything here has a cause within this whole universe, all the parts of it, doesn't mean that it's true that the universe itself must have a cause. However, I think we're misunderstanding what's going on there. You could argue that, well, each part is the whole. So each cause of each part is, in its constitution, the causes, the amalgamation of causes of the universe. So if you work all the causes of all the things back to some sort of beginning, does there not have to be a start to all of those separate individual causes, however disparate they become, however numerous? So the fallacy of composition is a difficult idea. Some people think that the fallacy of composition does genuinely show a problem. Some people think that it doesn't. Depends on how you see the difference between parts and wholes. Whether the parts make the whole or whether the whole is something different from the parts. Issue number 4, the impossibility of a necessary being. So some would argue that there isn't such a thing as a necessary being. Okay? It's not something we can really conceive of, there being a necessary being out there. There's no reason to think that there could be this necessary being. And then issue number 5, does the universe actually need an explanation? Do we really need sufficient reason? So looking back at Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, it could be argued there that there's a difference between the laws of thought and the laws of the actual world. Just because you might need sufficient reason to show how one thought leads to another doesn't necessarily mean that those same laws of thoughts apply to the laws of the world, that the world needs this same kind of explanation. It could just be, as Bertrand Russell puts it, a brute fact. I should say the universe is just there, and that is all. There doesn't need to be these other explanations. Nor might we say that we could ever know what that will be, nor prove it, nor even touch on it. So therefore we just have to settle with the idea that it is just there, it is just here. The present moment is just here. Okay, so lastly then, teleological arguments for God. I know we're very quickly briefing over all of this for revision, but let's just finish off with teleological arguments. Design arguments for God, using arguments from analogy. So we'll start with Aquinas' fifth way. Things that lack intelligence, such as living organisms, have an end. They have a purpose. Things that lack intelligence cannot move towards their end unless they are directed by someone with knowledge and intelligence, with the will to do so. That puts it into motion. Premise 3, for example, an arrow does not direct itself towards its target. It needs an archer to direct it. Conclusion, therefore, by analogy, there must be some intelligent being which directs all intelligent natural things towards their end. So the idea here is, for everything to be as it is, it seems as though, or at least for something to have some sort of function or purpose, from what we know of things that don't do it themselves, we have to do it for them. i.e. things that don't think, things that don't have conscious will. They don't just do things on their own accord. We have to do it for them. We're the creators. We design what they do and how they do it. On that basis, by analogy, Aquinas argues the universe works in a similar vein, does things, functions in particular ways, has particular ends, doesn't do it by its own accord, therefore it must be God that has made it such a way. So, looking at Hume's now, a slightly different one. So we're going to look at all these different types of teleological arguments. Hume's comes from, he actually puts forward an argument in order to argue against it. And he does this through three characters. We're only going to look at two of them, Philo, Cleanthes, and Demia. So he's basically putting forward, so he's using this sort of like dialogue between these characters in order to prove some sort of prove his own arguments, I suppose. So Cleanthes puts forward the design argument, which is basically Hume's putting forward the design argument as he sees it, and Philo's going to argue against it, which is basically Hume arguing against it. So he puts forward the design argument as such. Premise 1, complex machines are designed by intelligent beings, hence humans. Premise 2, the universe resembles human-made machines in its complexity, order, and purpose. Therefore, the universe likely has a similar cause, an intelligent designer which is God. So that's the argument from analogy as put forward by Hume. Paley's argument, so there's going to be 4 of these by the way, so this is 2 more. Paley's argument from spatial order and purpose. So is this watchmaker argument. A watch has certain features of spatial order and purpose. Premise 2, anything which exhibits these features must have been designed. Premise 3, from premise 1 and premise 2, therefore the watch must have a designer. The watch didn't just spontaneously come into existence. It was intricately put together by someone with the will to do so, and intelligence. Premise 4, the universe exhibits features of spatial order and purpose, similar to a watch. Premise 5, from premise 4 and premise 2, therefore the universe must have a designer. Because the things that exhibit the features of spatial order and purpose must have a designer. Because the universe exhibits those features, the universe must also have a designer. Therefore, that must be God. God exists. So it's kind of like this, all right? So with Paley, he wants to avoid this infinite regress, going back to this whole infinite regress thing. So it's just that idea that what designed that thing and that thing and that thing and that thing? Where does it end? Okay, so for Paley, what designed us? So we design things, but what designed us? And we want to avoid the infinite regress of things designing things, and that must be God. Okay. Lastly then, Swinburne's argument. This is the probably slightly more difficult one. So premise 1, regularities of succession occur both as natural phenomena and as a result of free human action. Regularities of succession is just things happening in a regular order, okay, in a kind of logical order. Regularities of succession in the human world can be explained by the rational choices of free human action. Our beliefs and desires explain why things have happened in a particular order. Premise 3, this is because free agents have intelligence, power and freedom to bring about regularities of succession, okay, to bring about this kind of logical order. Premise 4, regularities of succession as a result of natural law in the natural world cannot be fully explained by reference to other natural laws, for then we have an infinite regress. Premise 5, however, by analogy from 2, regularities in the natural world can be explained by rational choices of a free agent. Premise 6, the universe is immense and complex, therefore there must be a free agent who is as immense and complex that explains the regularities of the natural world, and that free agent is God. So, a little bit of a long argument here, but all he's saying really is we can see that logical patterns of things in the human world are done because of the thoughts that we have, the logical thoughts that we have. And we see that in the natural world, things also follow these logical patterns too. So by analogy, from what we do and how we follow these logical patterns by our rational choices and being reasonable, that must also be true of why the natural laws and the natural process of the world are as they are, by analogy. And therefore, that must be the rational choices of an immensely powerful and complex being, which is God, the designer of this world. Okay, finally then, we'll get onto the issues and then we're finished. Overall issues with the design argument. So, Hume actually puts forward 3 points from Philo against Cleanthes and says that machines start as botched projects that keep getting remade to get better and better. So if you're comparing machines to the world on that analogy, then the world may also be a botched job, and the creator therefore is imperfect. So it can't be this perfect God that we put forward in classical theism. Or number 2, complex machines are not usually the product of one creator, but a number of creators. As we see when we're designing things, there's loads of people involved, sharing ideas. Therefore, it's not one God. If by analogy that must be true. Maybe there's multiple gods. Again, arguing against this classical theist view of this monotheistic perfect being, by analogy. And number 3, if God is like the designers of machines, i.e. humans who like inventing things, then God can also be foolish and morally weak, as inventors might be. Therefore, God isn't this perfect, great, all good being, by analogy. So it's taking the argument from analogy and showing how it might disprove God as being this thing like classical theists like to think God is. So if the universe were really designed by a perfect being, there would not exist the disorder that we see. So that's in essence what Hume's getting at, or Philo. So what is Paley's reply? Paley replies to this and says that disorder does not undermine the design argument. Just because there is disorder in the world does not mean that there is not a designer. So what he's saying here is Hume hasn't actually undermined the design argument itself, although it has presented problems in terms of, well, who is the designer? What is the designer? But the design argument itself still seems to hold, regardless of Hume. Could be that the designer willed it that there was disorder for whatever reason. It is part of the design itself. So it doesn't actually undermine God in that same way. Issue number 2, argument from a unique case. So the universe is unique in that it has no comparisons, unlike watches and machines, therefore cannot infer that the world is anything like watches and machines. So because the world is this case that we don't have any comparisons to, it's this greatest whole thing that we can't even really understand completely. That's very different to watches and machines. They do have comparisons. We can see that machines and watches can be like each other. But we can't then compare them to something that doesn't have comparisons itself, because the universe is this thing that's way beyond watches and machines. So we can't make that analogy, because the universe is something quite different from watches and machines. You can compare machines with machines, watches with watches, not watches and machines with the universe itself. But Paley says we don't need comparisons to infer that something seems to be designed. Let's say we're an alien, right? Came onto the planet and saw a watch. Even if we'd never seen a watch before or had anything to compare it against, we could still, according to Paley, see that that watch must have been designed by an intelligent designer. Taking that same idea, seeing that, you know, everything follows this complex order, doesn't need a comparison to understand that it must have had an intelligent designer. Would you go somewhere, right? Let's say you've never seen a watch before. You're an alien. You've just landed on the planet. Would you think that this watch could have just emerged, just like nature is said to have just emerged out of nothingness? Maybe you would. Maybe you would think, oh, that's just like a part of nature, that watch, because you've never seen a watch before. Who knows? That's up to you to decide. Right, last kind of objections is just to ask, is God the best or only explanation? So Hume, it's possible that order and complexity could be the result of random processes. Why does it have to be a God? Why does any of this emergence of things have to be explained by a designer with a will to make everything happen? Why could it not just have spontaneously emerged by random processes into this great order? It's quite thought of in the sciences that enough iterations of random processes would create order. I'm not so sure about this. I'm not so sure if random processes would create the order that there is. I don't think this kind of argument is maybe enough. Is it enough? Would all of this complexity and order really have occurred from absolutely random processes? Is that ever possible? Will we ever know? Hume thinks it's possible. It could just be the result of a worldly architect. It doesn't have to be God. It might be something else, some sort of alien thing that's created this. But I suppose that complexity and order of nature and the universe itself, if that was a worldly architect, I guess we would just call that God, I suppose, is what some would say. Some say that all of this order and complexity comes as the result of evolution by natural selection. Again, there is an argument that, well, that doesn't... So evolution by natural selection is basically to say, like, if you're going to argue that from an atheistic point of view, evolution by natural selection, what you're saying is evolution by natural selection is purely random processes that have just emerged spontaneously. And we've just got this sort of like process of evolution by natural selection. But some people would say, well, no, evolution by natural selection must have been the product of, it must have started by something like a God. It doesn't disprove God, but it's whether you think that evolution by natural selection is just this random emergence in a natural world, or whether you think it's something that God's put there. At least the evolution by natural selection shows that the classical ideas, the biblical ideas of how the world came into being probably isn't right. Okay, that's probably what it did. But where does God stand now? Well, it's still up for debate. Swinburne's reply, the last point I'm going to make, Swinburne's reply to all of this is to say that biological processes may be explained by natural selection. Yes, maybe not God, but natural selection. It could be explained by God as well. But the fine-tuned laws that allow for these biological processes actually require an explanation themselves. So how did these fine-tuned laws that could have been any other way in a random, emergence of random processes that came to the universe's existence, why is it that these fine-tuned laws are so important for there to be life? Surely if they are so fine, that there must have been some explanation for this. That has to be some sort of transcendent thing, transcendent reason or reality that's created everything as it is. So that's it. Have a think around all of that stuff. That's all the arguments for God for A-level philosophy, and lots to think about there.
May I remember, may I remember this, may I remember